The most common question that I get asked when people find out that I converted to Orthodox Christianity is why? Why did you decide to become an Orthodox Christian? Why did you decide to follow Jesus Christ, let alone Orthodox Christianity of all different types of Christianity? And almost always I give the same response. It's simple, it's blunt, and it also is a little uncomfortable to hear. I became an Orthodox Christian because it is the truth. And almost always, the person who I'm talking to when I say that, like I watch them physically become a little uncomfortable. Why is that? Because here in the modern world, especially in the Western world, especially here in Australia, truth doesn't exist. Truth isn't talked about. Truth has become subjective. Truth has become whatever you want truth to be. You have become the decider of truth. You have become God. And that's the case here in Australia, where we're a very secular country. If you don't live in Australia, I'm telling you, Australia is a lot more secular, a lot more non-religious than you think. You know, I hear stories all the time, especially of people from America. They come visit Australia and they're like, wow, this country is very secular. People don't believe in God. Not only that, like they're not anti-religious, they're not demonic or anything like that. There definitely is those corners of people. But there's a huge spirit of indifference. You don't talk about Jesus Christ. You don't talk about religion publicly. You don't do it, especially amongst your friends or family, without a very huge risk of being a bit stigmatized, of being a bit frowned upon. Not because, look at you, you're religious, you know, that's terrible, but because why would you? Why would you be religious? Why would you follow Jesus Christ of all religions? You're laughed at. You're given weird looks. I've had that happen to me in the last year many times. And it's very sad. It's very sad. The very common mindset here is religion is a thing of the past. Religion is an ancient, outdated thing that you don't need anymore. But then it's funny because at the same time, all these people who talk about religion no longer being needed, being a thing outdated, are just as unhappy as everyone else, starting with myself. When you live in a country that's very secular, you naturally ask a lot of big questions because, well, you're human and God made you to ask those big questions. These questions are, where the heck did that come from? Where am I headed? What is the meaning of my life? Is there a real objective meaning to my life? Is there life after death? Or once I die, there's absolutely nothing happen? And a lot of people go on these searches. And sadly, a lot of people never are able to go on these searches because of the people around them, because of the friends and the family around them. Only by the grace of God was I able to explore these questions, as you will see in the background with this bookshop, as I say. It's definitely not a bookshop, with this bookshelf. Starting at the bottom, I didn't begin with Christianity. I began with atheism. I began with a lot of scientific schism, you know, a lot of books heavily focused on science as a religion, a lot of books focused on health and fitness as your religion. What do I mean like that? Although a lot of the philosophies we see in the modern world that talk about different ideologies, you know, science, health, fitness, a lot of these things we use to replace our yearning for God. And I see this very clearly in my former self, especially amongst fitness. I started getting into pretty extreme bodybuilding. I know it may not look like it, I'm not as big as I once was, but tracking every calorie, going to the gym 6-7 days a week. I started getting into a lot more of cardio fitness, a lot of the suffering stuff. And I think you know where I'm getting at here, especially in Orthodox Christianity, where there's a huge focus on suffering. I started getting a lot of cardio, marathons, trail marathons, swimming, bike riding. I did a half Ironman, which is where you do like a 2-kilometer swim into a 90-kilometer bike ride into a half marathon. I started getting obsessed with a lot of these things. because I was yearning for something beyond the superficial life, and because man knows that he's made to suffer, which is what we see so concretely within Orthodox Christianity. I also got big into a lot of money. I worshipped money for a very, very long time. I tried to find something that I could hold onto, something that was real. I worshipped a lot of people, a lot of self-improvement people who were nothing but a lesser version of Jesus Christ, who of course is the ultimate so-called self-improvement. And then after a very long journey, I actually knew about Christianity. I knew about Jesus Christ, but although I knew the name Jesus Christ, I didn't know what it actually meant to follow Jesus Christ. I so badly wanted to follow Jesus Christ, as you saw by just the very, very short stories I gave you about my youth growing up. I so badly wanted to. I knew what he represented, I knew the words he said, but I just could not find a way to actually do it in my life that made sense. And I went down some pretty bad understandings of Jesus Christ. Growing up in a very rational world here in Australia, which is very overtly rationalistic, very logical. Not that that's a bad thing. Christianity is the most rational and logical thing. But when we purely base off our life on rationalism rather than the other things that decide truth, such as spirituality and a prayer life, we become unbalanced. So let me explain. I fell in love with a certain YouTuber named Cliff Connectley. He goes around in America to many different college campuses, universities, and he preaches Christ. But he preaches it in a way that's very logical, very rational. He talks about the evidence for Christ, and I loved it. Why? Because here in the West, we base basically everything off rationalism. We have this huge idea that science, that's where the evidence is, and there's not evidence for religion and God and an afterlife, and we have to go where the evidence is. And so seeing someone who's a Western man go about saying that yes, there's evidence for science, but there's also more evidence for the fact that God created everything and that Jesus Christ is God revealed, that spoke to the Western mind. But even after a year or two of diving into that, of calling myself a Christian, at least on a very lower level, and talking about the evidence and the science, there was always something that I felt missing. And only after I left school, it's hard to say, but the bottom line was I was too embarrassed to explore Christianity during my school years. Because as I mentioned earlier in the video, you don't talk about Christianity in Australia without a huge risk of just socially isolating yourself amongst your friends and your family. So after I left school, I really had now the freedom to properly explore things. And I discovered church history. I discovered that there was history to Christianity, and that it was vast, it was beautiful. And I dived right into that. And I found a lot of church fathers, a lot of writers of this time, a lot of people who are considered saints within the church, who wrote about things to do with Jesus Christ, to do with his church, that I wasn't hearing today in the very rational, very logical Protestant mindset that I very much fell into in the past years. And I realized that the understanding of Jesus Christ within the first 1,000 years, especially within the first 500 years of Christ, was extremely different to our modern understanding of Jesus Christ. And I asked myself a question: who would better understand Jesus Christ? Myself and the people who live today, 2,000 years after Jesus Christ? Or the disciples of the disciples of Jesus Christ, of the disciples of the disciples of Christ? The people who knew someone who knew Christ, the people who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew Christ. And the way these people spoke and the things they spoke about, saying things like, who can say they have God as their father who does not have the church as their mother? The way they spoke about the sacraments and the mysteries, things like Holy Eucharist, confession, and the role of a bishop in the church, was alien to my current modern understanding of Christianity. And I realized I had to go on a journey. If I really wanted a relationship with Jesus Christ, if I really wanted to follow Jesus Christ, what did it mean to follow someone? It meant to do as they say. But who am I to know what Jesus Christ is telling me to do? Who am I to interpret his words? What if I had the people who knew Christ and they can interpret his words? The people who knew Christ, what are their interpretations? What is the consensus of Christianity within the first 1,000 years of Jesus Christ? What was their understanding of Jesus Christ? And I had nothing to lose, because although I was following a very relationship orientated version of following Christ, it's all about relationship, not an institution, not a building, not a church, something just felt missing. And then one day I got invited to a Pentecostal church by a co-worker of mine, a friend of mine at work. And I thought, great, I have nothing to lose. Let's go along to this. I have no idea what Pentecostal church is, but surely, it's just a church and it should just be the church. And here I'll find what I'm looking for. No, definitely did not find what I was looking for. Great people, phenomenal people, very welcoming, very loving. But something felt very off in the way they were worshipping God. The loud music, the heavy emphasis on the preacher or the pastor, and how there were so many different people preaching, on the big emphasis on the neon lights, on a very modern way. It felt like a concert. Something felt wrong. If I was after the way that Christians worship Christ within the first 1,000 years of Christianity, I don't think a church with neon lights, with smoke and with piano guitars would be that. But I had no idea how to logically explain it in my head. Why was this not the church? Why can't they just worship God in their own way? If they just like worshiping God with neon lights and guitar, who am I to say that's wrong? But regardless, something felt wrong, and so I did not keep going to that. Then I dived a bit more into church history, and I discovered that more or less the church was one for the first 1,000 years. But then what happened? Why is there so many different churches today? Why is there the Catholic Church, and then all the Protestant churches, the Orthodox Church, all the non-denominational churches? Why are they all claiming to be the church? Or some of them saying there's no such thing as the church? How do I navigate this? Because they are so very different and they contradict each other in very important ways. Then I discovered and I learned about the Great Schism, about how around the end of the first millennia, around the 10th, 11th, a bit earlier than that, so like the 8th, 9th, 10th century, the church split. And the West, the Latin Roman Catholic Church, went their way with the Pope. And then the rest of the church, the East, the Orthodox Church, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, all went their way. And this was a pretty big revelation, because I discovered that I could really narrow down my options for the church into two, that being the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this is where I put myself through hell. This is why I've titled this video, I Went Through Hell. Because over the next 6 months or so, even longer, I basically dedicated my whole life to discerning between the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Now, I wish it was as simple as just looking at a Catholic church or Orthodox church and just being like, yeah, that feels right. But I knew the gravity of the situation. I knew that both the Catholic Church, at least it once did, the Catholic Church believed that salvation was only found within the Catholic Church. The reason I say it once did is because you look at some more modern Catholic writings and it's not as blunt as it once was a long time ago. And I knew that the Eastern Orthodox Church claimed the same thing. Salvation was only found within the Orthodox Church. In the beginning, I had a bit of an issue with this. You're telling me that if I follow Jesus Christ and I love Jesus Christ and I put my faith in him, you're telling me that just because I'm not in an Orthodox church or a Catholic church, that I'm doomed forever. I had a big problem with that. But as I learned more about what it actually meant to follow Christ, I discovered that if I say I follow Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ says to enter my church, to follow my church, if he says that and I'm not doing that, well then, am I following Jesus Christ, or am I following my own understanding of Jesus Christ. I also discovered that the church was not a thing to tick off a box. It was not, I can tick off the box of going to church to ensure I'm saved on the day of judgment. It was Christ saying, you're weak, you're sinful, I'm here to help you, and I'm here to give you some tools that will help you on earth, that being the church. And so I began to realize that, hey, the church has a very serious argument for being taken seriously. But then I had to realize, okay, the church is very, very important to the Christian life. It's very crucial for salvation. It's really between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. How in the world do I go about choosing? How in the world do I go about choosing? And I realized that what I was getting at was truth. And this ties back to what I said in the beginning about how the only reason I became an Orthodox Christian is because it is the truth. What in the world is truth? No one ever told me what truth was. Like the most fundamental, most important aspect of life is truth, is doing things that are right, not falling into lies, not lying to yourself, which is evil. I had no idea what that was. And for a long time, I thought truth was purely rational, purely logical, mathematical, scientific, being able to fully map things out, in your head. They completely make logical sense. But I realized that that wasn't all there was to truth. And the reason why is because the first Orthodox church experience, I was invited by a friend of mine. He had heard about my Pentecostal church experience and he said, come on down to the Orthodox church. And the second I walked in, I felt something I'd never felt before in my life. I felt as if I'd stepped into truth. In some very famous words, I did not know whether I was in heaven or whether I was on earth. I felt as if I had experienced truth, and it was the most backwards thing to my Western mind ever before, because truth was not an experience. Truth was not spiritual. Truth was not energy. To my Western mind, truth was purely rational and mathematical, but I had experienced truth, and this experience did more for me than all the years of looking into the evidence of Christianity. I can pull up all these books right now. I have like a whole stack of books that talk about the evidence for Christ, the case for Christianity. Purely walking into an Orthodox church, seeing the way they worshipped God, seeing the way the divine liturgy was conducted, seeing the way people carried themselves, the way they made the sign of the cross, the way that they venerated icons, the way the priest was treated, the way the priest carried himself, especially this, the way the Holy Eucharist was treated, it felt as if I truly was in heaven. And I recall a quote from St. John Chrysostom, and it's along the lines of, when you see the lamb slain in church, when you see the Holy Eucharist, do you still think you are on earth? And I know what he means. I know exactly what it means when I experienced a divine liturgy. But still, I was holding on to my former self that was very logical, that wanted to understand things in a very rational way. And this is what I mean when I said I put myself through hell. I had to know why the Orthodox Church was the truth. The Catholic Church was so overwhelming in the West. When people think of Christianity, they equate Christianity to the Catholic Church. It just is Christianity. Most people don't even know about Orthodox Christianity. It's just this tiny group of people who are very Eastern, Greek, Russian, Macedonian, Serbian, all of that. It's not the main thing. It's just this weird, odd thing in the background. I had to know why. And I decided that if truth is by experience, I'm going to go experience the Catholic Church. And so I went and experienced the Catholic Church. I went along with my friend who was a very similar position with me. And I said, hey man, let's go experience this. Experience the Orthodox Church with me. Also experience the Catholic Church. And I was very underwhelmed. And it saddened me because I really expected more from the Catholic Church. And I don't mean this in like a dickhead way. Like, I'm just being purely honest and frank with you. Seeing the way that the divine liturgy was conducted within the Orthodox Church compared to this Catholic Church was very, very different. At a minimum, if not worse, it was just at a very minimum, very different. Watching the priest, I believe, consume the host. I believe it was the body of Christ on behalf of everyone else. That's a big difference compared to the Orthodox Church, where everyone gets to partake, assuming they're Orthodox Christian and in the right spiritual state. They get to partake, they get to be gifted the body and blood of Christ. Seeing the emphasis on secular music, secular rhymes, seeing they have TV screens and they have a guitar and a piano and this and that, it was startling how different it was to the ancient and reverent aspect of the Orthodox Church. And I was saddened because I really hoped for more. I really hoped that if this was the biggest group of Christianity in the world, that there would be more. So I decided I would give it another chance. And I went and visited a Catholic cathedral. I went to St. Patrick's in Melbourne. Huge cathedral, beautiful, stunning. And here I was very observant because this was really going to be, the biggest experience I was going to get of the Catholic Church. It's a cathedral. It should be where the best of the Catholic Church is. I was very observant. And it really hit the nail in the coffin for me in regards to believing that the Orthodox Church was the truth. Watching specifically the way the Eucharist was approached. And the reason why I'm placing such emphasis on the Eucharist and on the divine liturgy, I can go into stuff like the papacy, the filioque way, uncreated, created grace. But ultimately, all that aside, the divine liturgy and the Catholic Mass, the prayer service every Sunday, and the Eucharist is everything to the Christian life. It is where I am going to be spending every Sunday for the rest of my life. It is where that I will be meeting my future wife, girlfriend, whatever. That is where I'll be with her for the rest of my life. That is where I'll be raising my children into. This is very, very important, not even to mention salvation. And so I took it very seriously, and I watched the way that the Eucharist was treated. And when I saw everyday people who weren't priests, weren't monks, an everyday layperson, a man and a woman, stand up, talk within church, and then hold the Holy Communion, the bread of Christ, and hand it out to people, I was blown away. Just think about the way it's treated in the Orthodox Church. The Eucharist is treated truly like the body and blood of Christ. The only person touching it, going near it, doing things with it, is the priest. And even then, they are treating it like it's gold. Now, I heard a story once of how a priest dropped it and how he had to go down and eat it off the ground because it truly is the body and blood of Christ. Now, that might sound a little insane to the Western mind, but if something is the body of God, what is that compared to gold? And I bet if you drop gold, you'd pick it up. So if it's the body of God, who's infinitely more valuable than gold, entirely makes sense. And just comparing that to the way that the divine liturgy was gifted out by God in the divine liturgy, with a chalice, like a bowl, and then like a spoon, compared to the Catholic Church where it was just given out, I asked myself, theology aside, if I could only see the way that the Eucharist was treated in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, where would I truly believe it was the body and blood of Christ? 10 out of 10 times it would be in the Orthodox Church. And as I read more of the saints pre-schism, the church fathers, and I saw how important the Eucharist was and how it was treated as life-saving gift and truly the body and blood of Christ, and how Christ says, this truly is my body and my blood, poured out for the forgiveness of sins of many. It really hit the nail in the coffin. But once again, I love putting myself through hell, and I really had to make sure. So I went and visited a Catholic monastery, and I spoke to a Catholic monk. And without going too much into detail, because this story is quite a bit, overwhelmingly nothing compared to the Orthodox Church. And so that is the main reason I became Eastern Orthodox. I can talk about the Pope, I can talk about the filioque way, I can talk about uncreated versus created grace, we can talk about Mary and the Immaculate Conception. But the biggest reason that I chose to become Eastern Orthodox was because of the experience, because that is the strongest indicator of truth. And the reason why, to bring it home, I'll share a story here and I'll finish it here before I yap too long. One day I walked into church. I was there to visit the priest there. And a woman walked in after me, a bit after me. She didn't know I was there. She really did not know I was there. I know why, because, well, later on she said it, but also just the way that she so authentically approached God. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The way she was truly in the moment and truly acted and felt as if she was before the presence of God. The way she venerated the icons, the saints there, as if they were truly there, as if they were truly windows to heaven, as we understand within the Orthodox Church. And I looked at myself. It was a mirror. It was a reflection of myself. This woman, well, before that, I was in the midst of the sermons between the Catholic and Orthodox Church. And I was reading all these books, hundreds of books on, not hundreds, tens, 20 books on Orthodox and Catholic theology. I was reading about the ecumenical councils, Council of Nicaea, Council of Chalcedon, Canon 26, iconoclasm, Second Council of Constantinople, this, that, thinking about the filioque and the hypostasis, and about the economia, the temporal mission of the Holy Spirit. This church father quote, I was putting myself through hell on a very logical level. This woman, I assume, knew nothing of that. Nothing. And yet, I did. And yet here was her, approaching God, kneeling before the presence of God in a way more humbly, more meekly, more piously, more reverently, more authentically than I had ever done. And she knew nothing of all that stuff I just mentioned. But I did, and I knew it all pointed to orthodoxy. And still then, I was worshiping God. I was standing before the presence of God, nothing like her. And that's when I realized that truth, although all the theology, although all of that church truth is very important, what is most important is the experience and humbly standing before God. And then what really, really, towards the ends of when I finally decided to become Orthodox, what really allowed me to take that step was prayer, was praying before God and saying, Lord, you've put me all through this, and I've definitely put myself through a lot of it, because a lot of it was very torturous, and I did not have to do that. And I've done all of this, I've read about all of this, I've studied all of this, I've visited the Catholic Church here, the Protestant Church here, the Orthodox Church here, and I overwhelmingly believe it all points to the Orthodox Church. It doesn't even come close. But Lord, I'm weak. I find it hard to fully step into something, and in the back of my head, I always doubt. I always think, what if I've made a mistake? What if I'm wrong? What if this? What if that? And I just said to God, if this is your will for me to become Orthodox, allow it to take place. If it's not your will, I said this over and over. If it's not your will for me to become Orthodox Christian, but to become Roman Catholic or whatever else, please, Lord, make that clear. And the Lord made it very clear to me that it was His will for me to become Orthodox Christian. So yeah, that's my very summed up journey of becoming Orthodox Christian. I put myself through hell, and so I make this video, and I make all these videos because I think you don't have to go through hell to become Orthodox Christian. I believe that although you need to give your due diligence, because that's what truth demands, there's much easier ways to go about it. And so if I can share my lessons, my experiences here, I can make it a lot easier for you. Ultimately, because nothing will compare to Orthodox Christianity. I'm telling you right now, nothing will compare to it. This is where you truly develop a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not saying I'm there. I'm the worst Orthodox Christian you'll find. But in all my years of searching for Christ, of trying to build that relationship, I've only truly found it going somewhere within the Orthodox Church. And now I can't speak for everyone. I'm not saying I can. But I do know that that's very, very unanimously agreed upon within the church, especially the Orthodox Church, that when you step into the church, when you partake in the sacraments and the mysteries that Christ told us to do, when you confess to a spiritual father that Christ gave him the ability to do, that is when you truly begin to follow Jesus Christ, because you're doing what he commanded you to do. And now, just a final note, I don't suppose that I'm perfect. I don't suppose that I've made the perfect decision. I'm fallible. I make mistakes. And if you're someone who's Roman Catholic, I'm not saying that you're utterly wrong and doomed. I don't bloody know. I believe wholeheartedly that the church is the body of God, and therefore God, who is salvation, and that is the church, therefore the church is salvation. But I'm not here saying that I'm perfect. I'm worse off before anyone, before God. And this was a lesson I learned very early on from an Orthodox priest, was that just because the Orthodox faith is the true faith does not make us better. It makes us worse, because on the day of judgment, what excuse do we have when it comes to the church? You know, God will say, you had the Orthodox faith, you had the true faith. And so I want to leave it on that note. Be humble through your discernment process. Give truth your due diligence. Rely heavily on experience, prayer, and being humble before God and asking God for His will to take place. And yeah, I'll be going through a lot more videos, talking through a bit more of the other things. You know, this video is heavily focused on experience and the journey, but I'll be talking about the Pope, the Filioque way, a lot of Catholic doctrines that just did not sit right and I do not believe are truth. I'll be talking about a lot of Protestant churches that I'd experienced about their doctrines. But I don't really want this channel to just be purely focused on polemics and attacking other churches. I don't want it ever to seem I'm attacking other churches. I'm purely being objective and truthful and acting exactly how I'd want a Catholic to act if they believed that the Catholic Church was the truth. Because, of course, the truth will set you free. God bless. Thank you for watching.